Good evening everyone, buonasera a tutti, and welcome to our webinar A Day with Dante. For those of you who are joining us today for the first time, benvenuti. I am 𝗂𝗏𝗶𝗵 𝗵𝗶𝗏, the director of the Italian Cultural Institute at the Embassy of Italy in Washington, D.C. Today, once again, we celebrate Dante Alighieri. If you connected with us for our previous programs, you will know that this year Italy commemorates the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. And to mark this occasion, the Embassy of Italy in Washington, D.C. and its consular and cultural network organized more than 60 events that will take place throughout the year and throughout the country. We will have presentations like today, but we will also have readings, films, dance performances, and much more. You can say therefore that this will be a Dante anno, a year with Dante. So why organizing an event called A Day with Dante? Well, because today, March 25th, is Dantedì, a national day dedicated to Dante Alighieri and chosen by the Italian government as this is the date given by scholars for the start of the journey to the afterlife in Dante's Divine Comedy. Given the interest around Dante this year, of course, we couldn't miss the celebration of Dantedì. Today's program is organized in collaboration with our amici at the Department of Italian at Georgetown University. Our embassy and our cultural institute have been collaborating with Georgetown University for many years now, and we couldn't be more grateful for their friendship and support. Before giving the microphone to our co-host, Professor Anna De Fina, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our two distinguished speakers, Professor Deborah Parker and Professor Denis Looney. I find it particularly appropriate that today, as we remember the start of Dante's journey, they will take us on a metaphorical journey to learn more about Dante himself and about his legacy in different literatures and cultures. So now I'm very honored to give the microphone to Professor Anna De Fina, Chair of the Department of Italian at Georgetown University. Anna.
Thank you. Good afternoon, buonasera a tutti. As Emanuele said, I'm Anna De Fina, the chair of the Italian department at Georgetown University. First of all, let me thank you all for being here in such high numbers. We're very happy to see that our call was received with such an enthusiasm. And I also want to thank the Embassy of Italy in Washington, D.C. and 𝗂𝗏𝗵𝗵 𝗵𝗶𝗶, director of the Italian Cultural Institute, for supporting this event and for being such a great collaborator. We've been collaborating on so many events throughout the years, and it's been very important for my department to count on them, as it has allowed us to spread the Italian culture in the US. I also want to recognize the sponsorship of the Doyle Engaging Difference program at Georgetown, which fosters awareness of diversity in our university and provides supports for professors who want to engage their students on this topic. This is an important day for us because I think it allows us to reconnect with Dante's journey in the afterlife 700 years ago and to explore its implications for today. As you will see, our invited speakers, Professor Denis Looney and Professor Deborah Parker, whom I thank very warmly for participating in this event, will highlight how Dante's work and trajectory are still very relevant in a time when diversity and social justice are such a central concern. I also want to thank warmly my colleagues 𝗵𝗱𝗁𝗍 𝗂𝗲 and Francesco Ciabattoni for organizing this event. 𝗵𝗂𝗁𝗍 𝗂𝗲, Professor 𝗵𝗂𝗁𝗍 𝗂𝗲 is our expert on the history of Italian theater, and Professor Ciabattoni is our stellar Dante expert and also a recipient of the Doyle Fellowship. So before I pass the baton to Professor Ciabattoni, let me remind you of the rules for participation in the webinar. If you want to ask a question, please use the question answer button at the bottom of your screen. And then because we will have the presentations and then we'll provide, some of the questions that you have put on the question answer area. So thank you very much again, and I will pass the baton to Professor Ciabattoni. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Anna, and thank you, Emanuele. Thanks to our guests, Deborah Parker and Denis Looney. I wish to also thank, of course, Gianni for helping me through this wonderful day. There will be two excellent talks, and I would like to start introducing our first speaker of the day. Denis Looney, who holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a BA in classical Greek from Boston University. He taught from 1986 to 2013 at the University of Pittsburgh with secondary appointments in classics and philosophy, but his main area was indeed Italian. He was chair also of the Department of French and Italian there for 11 years, and also assistant dean of the humanities at Pitt. Among his publications, we can mention Compromising the Classics, Romance Epic Narrative in the Italian Renaissance, 1996, which received honorable mention in the judging from the joint Howard Marara Prize and Scaglione Award in Italian Studies from the MLA. And then Freedom Readers, the African-American reception of Dante Alighieri and the Divine Comedy, published in 2011, which received the American Association of Italian Studies Book Prize, general category, in that same year. With Mark Costanza, Denis Looney is also the co-editor and translator of Ludovico Ariosto's Latin Poetry, 2018. And his talk today is titled Radical Dante. So with no further ado, I will leave the floor to Professor Denis Looney.
Thank you very much. I want to thank everyone, and I want to start out by sharing my screen. Thanks everyone. I thank you very, very much for the invitation and the camaraderie and the spirit of Dantedì. And I look forward to talking at the end of our two talks. I'm delighted to be here and honored to be here with Deborah Parker, a friend and a colleague in the profession, and with all of you great people at Georgetown, a great place for Italian, and the embassy and the Istituto Italiano di Cultura. I'm very honored. I'd like to start out with this image of Dante for my talk, Radical Dante, and it has a subtitle, Dante's world is an ordered world, and then an important additional word, but there are lots of exceptions to that order, and that's really what I want to talk about in focusing on Radical Dante. This is a painting that you may know. It's inside the Duomo here in Florence. It's from 1465, another anniversary year, 200 years after Dante's birth, by Domenico di Michelino, at a time when the Florentines, led by the 𝗪eci, were trying to get Dante back into their city. He's represented here outside the city, and that's not unimportant or inappropriate. I use this as a starting place to talk about the three kinds of order that Dante radicalizes: cosmological, moral, and aesthetic. You can see that in this world, as Michelino has painted it, things have their place from top to bottom, inside and out. The cosmology is all there in front of you. Hell, purgatory behind the figure of the poet, and then the heavens up above. There's a moral order too. There's the city of man on one side. There's the city of God. Actions have their place, right and wrong, good and evil. And then there's an aesthetic order as well, represented by the Divine Comedy and Dante's hand. There is the implications of this aesthetic order for his own literary production. This poem, the Divine Comedy that he's holding, represents the world as the artist is imagining it. More on that as we go deeper. I hope I'm not being too much of a pedantic professor, but let me just remind you, 1265, 1321, 1295, when Dante is 30, he enters politics. He joins a guild, a union of the apothecaries, and that gives him access to the political life. In 1300, he's elected a prior of Florence, one of the leaders of the town. In 1301, as many of you know, because of factionalism within his own party, the Guelph party, he is exiled from Florence. While he's on a trip, he's told that he can't come back into the Florentine territory. In 1302, he's sentenced to death. We actually have that document. It's a very tragic document to look at, where his own compatriots sentence him to death. He lives the rest of his life, 1301 to 1321, in exile. He never sees his wife. He connects with two of his four children, but he's detached from his books and everything, his life as a Florentine. This is one of the buildings of Dante's Florence, the Bargello, the Palazzo del Podestà, and in it there is a chapel where in 1840 an Anglo-American art historian uncovered this portrait of Dante. This is Dante about in 1300, at about the time he supposedly takes this trip to the afterlife, things that we're celebrating on Dantedì. This is young Dante. It's a portrait of Dante that gets a lot of publicity in the 19th century, turned into cards like this one that people carry around with them and buy when they're in Florence on the Grand Tour. English tourists, American tourists, Mark Twain was there, Russian tourists, Dostoevsky was there, French, all of the world is going on the Grand Tour across Italy, and they're stopping in Florence, and they're very excited about this portrait of young Dante, the politician, Dante the man in 1300. This is the Dante that we come to know better, perhaps, the death mask of Dante from 1321, that's the object of the plot in Dan Brown's Inferno. There he is. That's the Dante that we tend to think of, dour, suffering, pensive, troubled. Back to that image of Dante in Michelino's painting from 1465, holding up the Divine Comedy, just want you to see how it radiates, right? That poem, so there's a cosmological order that he represents in that poem. There's a moral order in his world that he represents in that poem. There's an aesthetic order that he glorifies, or that glorifies us, the reader, in that poem. But all throughout, Dante challenges or raises questions about order itself. He has doubts about many of the things his contemporaries take for granted, including some of the biggest questions of all, the questions about justice that his culture puts forth. More on that in just a bit. The poem is, in his nomenclature, called La Commedia. Later, commentators affix the adjective divine to it. It's divided up into those three parts. It tells the story of him taking this trip in 1300 at 35, nel mezzo del cammin, down into the underworld and then up purgatory and up through heaven in Easter week. He comes back to the secular world after 1 week of traveling. And then he's in these political brouhahas and he's exiled and he's sentenced to death. If we fuse these two calendars together, and then he begins writing the poem in 1306, which he finishes just before he dies in 1321. The Commedia, or the comedy, is often compared to a medieval Gothic cathedral for its order. And this is a medieval Gothic cathedral that Dante knew. He didn't know this facade. There's a statue of Dante in front of it now that was moved there in another anniversary year, 1865. But he knew this interior, sort of, more or less, with its successive chapels that are slightly smaller going down the nave, leading the eye or the foot down to the eastern end of the church, with the altar at that end point where God is the climax, or God as man is the climax, Jesus Christ on the cross hanging above the altar there. God as man is the ordering principle of the world. God orders Dante's cosmos, God orders Dante's thinking about morality, and God orders Dante's art. So you can find lots of images of Dante's Cosmos here on the left, and then Inferno and in other places, Purgatory and Heaven. I just want to hold this image up for you for a second while I talk about the first of these three kinds of orders that Dante is questioning, the cosmological ordering. You can analyze Dante's cosmos, the medieval cosmos, from a very scientific perspective. And I just want to draw to your attention that Dante knew the world was round, as did ancient philosophers 1,500 years ahead of him, earlier than he. Dante knew that the world was round. He believed that there was a sphere of earth and then a sphere of water, and a hemisphere of earth and a hemisphere of water. And at the bottom of the hemisphere of water, there was another protuberance of earth, Mount Purgatory. The world that Dante lived in, the cosmos, the physical world that Dante lived in, was very regularized. It was predictable within limits for Dante and for his peers, especially the ones who knew astronomy as well as he did, with the detail that he did. I don't think I'm going to be challenged much if I say Dante was, in addition to being a politician and a poet and lots of other things, he was a scientist, and he knew a lot about astronomy and about the stars, but about the planetary spheres as well. His main sources for this knowledge were Ptolemy's geocentric cosmology and Aristotle's basic natural philosophy, which is based on the science of the four elements, earth, water, air, and fire, arranged in that hierarchical order. There's a big irregularity here that really troubles Dante, and he writes about it right at the end of his life in 1320 or 21 in a work called the 𝗗𝗲𝗶𝗴𝗵, or the debate on water and earth. It records a debate that he participated in on the problem of the relation between earth and water according to Aristotle's hierarchical philosophy of nature. The debate focused on the contradictory position, or the apparent contradiction, with land in relation to water according to this hierarchy. If earth is heavier, as you see here, if earth is at the bottom of everything, how is it that earth, when you go to the seaside, rises up above the water? How is it that we see many examples of earth above water, not serving as a foundation beneath water, but up above it, rising above it, like you see all over Italy with islands and at the coast? Dante attacks this paradox in the 𝗗𝗗𝗄 like a scientist. To explain the presence of mountains above sea level, he concludes that topographical variety on Earth's surface is due to another variety that he can find in his cosmos, in the sphere of fixed stars up here. When he looks up at the sky at night, he sees bright stars, less bright stars. He sees flickering stars, solidly bright stars. He sees stars that look like they might be of different colors, and he thinks a lot about this diversity, and he concludes that the diversity of the stars generates a power that causes the mountains to rise out of where they should be, beneath the water, and up above the circumference of water. He's a medieval scientist using logical reasoning and his knowledge, which he gets from books, the tradition, but also from his own sensory perceptions. So in that way, he's a very modern, experimental kind of scientist too, from his perceptions of reality around him, to claim that the realm of the stars, the only thing he can see that is asymmetrical, is actually exerting a kind of lifting power on the land to cause the formation of mountains above sea level. He's like a modern scientist in his dependence on a physical, mechanical explanation for the phenomenon that he has observed. And he goes so far as to hypothesize that the mountains may be pulled up by a kind of magnetic attraction from the stars. It's a really extraordinary example of Dante as a modern thinker. And it's an extraordinary example of Dante challenging the cosmology that he's inherited from the tradition. But no sooner does he do this than he turns to a different tradition and he writes, quote, "Let men stop searching out things that are above them and let them seek up to such a point as they may, that they may draw themselves to immortal and divine things to their utmost power, and that they may abandon things too great for them." He then turns to the Bible, Job, Psalms, Isaiah, Paul's letter to the Romans, and warns the curious human not to overstep the bounds of appropriate knowledge. He gives God the last word, quote, "Whither I go, ye cannot come." Dante defaults to God, we could say, at the end of the 𝗗𝗗𝗄, but not before challenging an apparent feature of disorder in God's universe as he's inherited it. He does this in lots of examples from the moral realm. So we looked at cosmology and how Dante, I say, radicalizes or reinterprets or challenges that cosmological order. He does it also with morality. The primary fundamental sources for Dante's moral order are, of course, the Bible and church fathers, but also including St. Augustine, but especially Thomas Aquinas, whose moral teachings depend heavily on Aristotle's ethics, especially. Aquinas Christianizes Aristotle for Dante and for the medieval intellectual reader. But there's more than one striking place, irregularity or exception, I could call it, where Dante challenges that received Christianized Aristotelian moral doctrine or Aristotelianized Christian moral doctrine. God's justice at times troubles Dante. For example, in Inferno Canto 4, there are pagans. These are good people. These are virtuous pagans. This is where Dante finds, this is where Virgil resides with other great poets of antiquity. That's already an unusual arrangement, one might say, but it includes, among the virtuous pagans are included Saracens, practitioners of Islam, including this figure with the sword, this sort of crusading looking figure who is the Saladin, the warrior, Averroes, Avicenna, and probably many others that aren't named among the Arabic cultural world are a part of this virtuous pagan space, an exception. In Canto 5, the famous example of Paolo and Francesca, we always say Paolo and Francesca, but we should say Francesca and Paolo. She talks first. I mean, there's nothing unorthodox about that, but if you're a medieval reader, you come upon the first character who gets to talk in hell and gets to talk at great length is a woman speaking before any other sinner at great length. And so that seems to me a challenge to the expectations of what one might have. Deeper in hell, among the sodomites, homosexuals, Dante finds his teacher, Brunetto Latini, and other groups of sinners. They seem to all be men. And in Cantos 15 and 16, he talks with them in different conversations. And at one point he says in Canto 16, I would have jumped down into that ditch and embraced them if there hadn't been fire that I was afraid of. Sodomy or same-sex interaction or homosexuality seems not to be such a concern for Dante, even though he puts them in hell. But he puts some of them in hell. He doesn't put them all in hell, because when you go deeper and then up Mount Purgatory, you get to the very top among the lustful Purgatory, Canto 26. There are heterosexual poets and homosexual poets, and homosexual poets on the top of Mount Purgatory are next in line to become saints in paradise. They're going to be freed and they're going up and they're in heaven writing poetry and singing as we speak. This is not the typical medieval worldview of sodomy. This is, I think we can say, a forgiving view. It's a tolerant view. It's a view of sodomy that must have raised some eyebrows among Dante's readers. In the next canto, Inferno 17, usurers, bankers who make excessive interest off money, Dante finds 3 sinners. They're identified by their coats of arms, their families' emblems. And among them, if you're a typical medieval reader, your expectations are that here we are with bankers in hell. We know who they all are. These are Jewish bankers for sure, but they're not. They're all Christian. Again, Dante frustrates or teases or plays against one's expectations for what one might find. If I'm abusing the word radical, I think that's a kind of example of radicality on his part. Going deeper in Inferno, Canto 26. This is the great scene of Ulysses, the great canto that tells the story of Ulysses. That's the character of Homer, Odysseus, who starts here in Troy, and after Troy has fallen, he's headed home. He's at the end of the Trojan War, he's going home, but he zigzags all over the Mediterranean as far, we think, as the Iberian Peninsula. This, by the way, is a satellite shot of the Mediterranean. There's Europe, there's Africa, and here's Asia right over here. And there's the sea in between, the Mediterranean. But this is, taken from in our own times, with superimposed on it the zigzags of Odysseus's trip home. And here's home, Ithaca. But that's the way he goes to get there in Homer's poem, the Odyssey. Dante does something different. He rewrites that story, and he has the character sail out through the Straits of Gibraltar, turn left, and go down to this strange landmass that the character doesn't understand the origins of. It is Mount Purgatory, and he crashes and he ends up in hell. For Dante's readers, thinking cartographically in symbolic ways, the world looked like this. Here's the continent of Europe, here's the continent of Africa, here's the continent of Asia, here's the sea in between, the Mare Magnum, and then here's the Mare Oceanum encasing it all, that many of Dante's readers would have thought about in what's called a T&O map. Dante redoes this map and has his version of Ulysses sail out, go turn left, past Spain, past Africa, and go down to hell, go down to purgatory, from which point he's catapulted into hell. What is he doing in Canto 26? He's challenging, he's recreating a character who challenges the cosmological boundaries, who transgresses. He talks about transgression in that canto, the poet does, and he's doing nothing less than rewriting Homer's version of the Odyssey, or of Ulysses. What does it suggest about his own literary status that he does this? He proves the point that he makes in Inferno Canto 4 when he's with those virtuous pagans, and he says famously, I was sixth, io fui sesto tra cotanto senno. I was sixth in this collection of such wisdom. There's Homer, there's Virgil, there's Horace Ovid Lucan, and then there's me, Dante. He inserts himself into a literary canon. He wonders rhetorically about the dangers of transgressing, but he does it really with a kind of passion. As we go further into the poem, into purgatory, we come to yet more examples of this kind of radical positioning that the poet is practicing, I would say. The guardian of purgatory is a pagan, Cato. This pagan, Cato, as you can see from the image, takes a knife and sticks it in his side and commits suicide in the story in the historical event from Roman history, in protest against Julius Caesar's usurpation of liberty. Cato becomes a symbol of liberty for Dante. The fact that he's pagan doesn't matter. The fact that he is a suicide doesn't matter. Or maybe the fact that he's a pagan fighting against a certain kind of, fighting against the lack of freedom does matter. And that's what Dante wants to emphasize there. It's an unusual take. You won't find this in a sacred text, to put it mildly. And then we go higher up into paradise. In Canto 19, in the sphere of the just, Dante and Virgil witness something quite extraordinary. They're hovering there themselves, and they're surrounded by souls of the just that spell out letters that say the first line of the Book of Wisdom, love justice, you who judge or rule the earth. The last of those letters is M, teram, and that M transmogrifies into a big eagle that stands and talks, that hovers above Dante and Virgil. This is made up of thousands, gazillions souls, and talks to Dante and says, reading Dante's mind, poses a question that the pilgrim has always wanted to ask about justice. And here I think he is at his most radical. Here's the question. You've often asked, implying I think you go around and you talk to people about this problem. A man is born on the bank of the Indus River in India. Nobody there, I'll paraphrase, talks about Christ. This is before missionaries. Everything he does is good. His deeds are good. His words are good. He dies unbaptized. He lives in India, outside the faith. Where is justice if it condemns him? Wherein lies his fault if he does not believe? The eagle then gives the answer to the question, which he does in an elaborate paraphrase, but I'm going to do it more simply. The answer that Dante gets to this question, and the question is, how is it just for someone who doesn't know about Christ to be put in hell for not being a Christian? The answer to the question is, who are you to ask this question? The extraordinary fact is that Dante asks the question, and he puts it into his poem. He does it in this filtered way. It's the eagle talking for him, but he puts it into his poem, and every reader can hear it and can ponder it. And the question we could restate is, why wouldn't God grant universal salvation to good and just individuals. Turns out it's a question that evangelical Protestants, as recently as 2011, spend a lot of time thinking about. That is it right for people to be condemned to hell if they're good? And the meme or the topos or the trope that gets used in that kind of evangelical Christian discourse is Gandhi in hell? In a book called Love Wins, Rob Bell writes about this. He actually mentions Dante in the book, but he doesn't go into the kind of detail that I'm going, but he knows Dante. This popular Christian pastor asks the question about Gandhi and meditates on that question. I think that there is nothing more radical than that Dante does, or maybe there's one more radical thing I'll talk about in a second, but this to me is the ultimate challenge. You know, our culture defines justice in the following way. I'm not sure that I agree with what our culture thinks about God's justice. Let's talk about it. And then he gets told not to do that. So, cosmological ordering that Dante challenges, thinks about, moral ordering that Dante thinks about, and then to end up on aesthetic ordering that Dante thinks about. Everyone knows that he has this elaborate rhyme scheme, the 𝗗𝗓𝗄. Only one word, so the 𝗗𝗓𝗄 is set up in that way. There is one word, however, that can rhyme with itself. And it's a good word to be rhyming with itself because it's 3 in 1. Christo, and he does it, I believe, 4 times in the entire comedy. He does it in Canto 19, just after the passage of the Indian, Gandhi and hell passage of the just Indian. He does it, he continues to think about that. And here he talks about an Ethiopian who ought to be up in heaven, as opposed to all these hypocritical Christians. So it intrigues me that there's a man of color in India, a man of color in Africa. These are Dante's touchstones for challenging justice in a very powerful way. There may be one more radical thing that Dante does, and it may be the most obvious radical thing that Dante does. He tells us that the whole poem we're reading is true. Everything that's happening, like him flying on the back of that beast that you see there in that image in Canto 16, 𝗗𝗓𝗋, is true. His designation of the epic poem as a comedy is in part a recognition of its hybrid generic status, as he explains in this well-known letter to his patron, Epistle 10, where he says, quote, "It's a comedy. Its matter ends in prosperity. It has a happy ending." And then he also implies that part of the essence of comedy is the mixed nature of styles that one senses in the Divine Comedy. His poem has room for a description of God and a question about God's justice, but it also has room for, famously, a devil farting in Canto 21 of the Inferno. The art of fiction, it turns out, is something like a mixed hybrid creation. And we see this in the first of the 2 passages in the poem where Dante uses the word commedia. This is Canto 16, Inferno, line 128. As 𝗗𝗓𝗋, that's this creature, the embodiment of fraud, which is presented as the counterpoint to fiction, flies up from the bottom, the depths of hell to fetch the pilgrim and his guide in order to take them back down into the 8th circle. The poet feels the need to swear by the sound, per le note di questa commedia, by the sound of the notes of his poem, that what he is reporting to have seen, he really and truly saw it. He says, reader, you won't believe it, but I'm swearing this is what I saw. 𝗗𝗓𝗋, this thing, part dragon, part snake, part scorpion, with the face, you can't see it perfectly here, but with the face of a just man, Dante says. It's a kind of hybrid, a symbolic representation of fraud. It looks honest, Dante says, but he will sting you the minute he gets a chance. Fiction, that's fraud. Fraud looks honest, but it will get you. Fiction, the counterpoint to fraud, works in an opposite way. It looks false, but it is actually true. In the case of Dante's poem, it may appear that the pilgrim didn't do any of the things he tells us he did. He tells us he stepped onto a boat deep down in hell and it sunk down because he had body weight. But that may just, he tells us he did all these things. Are they true? He wants the reader to believe that he actually did it and adds these details. If fraud is false, but appears at first glance honest, fiction, by contrast, is truthful, though it might appear false at first glance. In other words, like the beast 𝗓𝗏, the art of fiction is hybrid. Dante's fiction, and this is the most radical thing of all, it turns out is true. Or as one famous critic, 𝗗𝗲𝗁𝗵𝗶 said memorably, the fiction of the Divine Comedy is that it's not fiction. That's what it's really about. Moby Dick is about a man obsessed with a white whale. Gatsby is about someone obsessed with power and money and silk shirts. The Divine Comedy is about the fact that it's not false. It really happened. It's true. In this way, Dante is radical, and he pushes the envelope again and again in different categories. And this makes him an excellent source for the writers that I look at in Freedom Readers, African-American writers, who are very interested in that radicality. They're interested in the political radicalism, but they're just interested in the way he pushes the envelope. These are Frederick Douglass, Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison, Gloria Naylor, and lots of other African-American writers. Irish writers are also interested in Dante for this reason, and other traditions for other reasons, for this same reason. I think Dante's radicality draws people in. His focus on transgression, his focus on challenging authority makes him a radical literary model himself for those who appreciate what he has done. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Denis. This is excellent. And I think that there is a lot to discuss and unpack. I see that some questions have already been posted, but we can hopefully address them after our next talk so that we can treat the two together. And I'm sure that there will be points of contact and interaction. So allow me to introduce our next speaker today, Professor Deborah Parker, who is Professor of Italian at the University of Virginia, and also the author of Commentary and Ideology, Dante in the Renaissance. That's her earliest book, Duke University Press, 1993. Deborah Parker is also the general editor of the website The World of Dante. She co-authored Inferno Revealed, From Dante to Dan Brown, back in 2013. And she was the director of an NEH seminar for high school teachers on reinventing Dante, influence, adaptation, and appropriation. She has published countless articles on especially the reception of Dante in art and literature. For example, just want to mention a couple: Bronzino's Dante and JFK's Dante. Because John Fitzgerald Kennedy also referenced Dante in some of his speeches. So she teaches courses, she has taught courses on Dante's Divine Comedy for 25 years. And her talk today is titled Dante in the World. The floor is yours, Deborah. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Francesco. So I'd like to thank first Francesco Ciabattoni, Emanuele Amendola, and Anna Defina, Georgetown University's Italian department, its Doyle program, and the Istituto Italiano di Cultura in Washington. Thank you all for inviting me to participate in today's Dantedì event. In addition, I'd like to thank Chinese writer San Shui, and scholar 𝗔𝗍 𝗔, Japanese scholars 𝗪𝗍 Ishiguro and Moritaki Hara for responding to some of my queries. I'm thrilled to be part of today's celebration. It's not an exaggeration to say that Dante is everywhere. The Divine Comedy has long fascinated cultures worldwide. Over the last 7 centuries, the poet's admirers have appropriated and transformed aspects of Dante's masterpiece in innumerable ways. The adaptations range from the mundane to elaborate. Vendors refer to the fires of hell to advertise spicy foods, describe calamitous events, or to conjure modern hells. There's also a lot of satiric humor, Last December, the Washington Post published a tongue-in-cheek editorial on the 9 levels of Melania Trump's Christmas decorations. Humorous references to hell's 9 circles are among the most common references to Dante. As we celebrate the 700th centenary of Dante's death, I'd like to address some of the ways in which other cultures have adapted Dante's poem. Many writers have taken up the subject of a journey through another world. The narrator in Lorenzo de' Medici's humorous poem 𝗵𝗶𝗋 encounters the drunkards of Florence. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland presents post-war London with its noxious fog as an urban hell. And James Joyce's Ulysses recounts Leopold Bloom's wanderings through Dublin's nightlife. These are all examples from the Anglo-American tradition. We know less, however, about the way in which Dante has been adapted by other cultures. Today, I will be looking at adaptations from Latin America, China, Japan, and Africa. Some may be familiar, others less so. Before turning to these examples, I'd like to say a few words about why the Divine Comedy is so adaptable. What are the features of the poem which lend themselves to adaptation? Dante's poem differs from other epics in one significant respect. He puts himself front and center into the poem. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. In the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wood. Homer, Virgil, and Milton did not insert themselves as characters in their epics. In the Divine Comedy, Dante is the pilgrim who undertakes a journey through the afterlife, and Dante the poet who writes about the experience. Dante is also an exile, banished from his native city of Florence. The fate of the historical Dante resonates deeply with those who have suffered the pain of exile or marginalization. Dante's afterlife is a highly visual world. In his essay on the Inferno, T.S. Eliot singles out for praise the poet's clear visual images. Dante's vivid descriptions of hell's landscapes and dramatic punishments have attracted many artists, among them Botticelli, Michelangelo, William Blake, Salvador Dali, Gustave Doré, and Robert Rauschenberg. We should keep in mind, too, that Dante's hell is a physical place, some sections of which share the features of a medieval city. Many adapters have followed Dante in creating infernal worlds and designating specific sites as noxious crime scenes. David Fincher, for example, presents New York as an urban hell in his film Seven, where the serial killer, John Doe, commits a series of murders exploiting the Dantesque notion of contrapasso, punishments which fit the sins. Lastly, one can present hell as a psychological state, as Milton does with Satan in Paradise Lost. I'm just going to cite one memorable line showing this. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. The possibilities for reconfiguring a hellish existence are rich and varied. So let's turn to some of these responses now. I'm going to start with an exuberant example from South America. On January 1st, 2018, Pablo Mauret, an Argentinian scholar now teaching at Florida State University, posted a challenge on Twitter, summoning all to an open, simultaneous, and massive reading of the Divine Comedy. 1 canto per day, 100 cantos in 100 days. Using the hashtag Dante 2018, Mauret's invitation attracted 2,000 participants by the 3rd day. 2018 quickly became one of the hottest trending topics in Latin America. At its height, about 5,000 readers were sharing comments. And the first slide here shows you some of the comments that readers shared. So they were sharing comments, selfies, maps of hell, and illustrations. That's a pretty big class. A wide range of teachers participated, a wide range of readers participated, and they include South American Dante scholars, political ministers, an ex-soccer player, that would be Asprilla, artists, and Spanish speakers from Buenos Aires, Chile, Peru, Venezuela, the US, Mexico, China, and Australia. Newspapers in Latin America, Italy, and the US featured articles on the phenomena. The collective participatory platform of Twitter, along with its continuous availability, fueled the project's success. Many participants had long wanted to read Dante, but they didn't feel that they could adequately undertake the reading of a medieval epic on their own, with Mauret and other scholars serving as guides. Any perceived difficulties were quickly dispelled. On April 10th, 2019, Pablo Moret was invited to read the last canto in Ravenna, Dante's last refuge. Few undertakings have attested so dramatically and dynamically to Dante's global appeal. There are, of course, more traditional forms of influence in Latin America, but my goal today is to give you a sense of the range and variety of responses. I'm now going to turn to a very different form of homage. Chinese appropriations of Dante are not easily condensed. The first Chinese translation of 1921, which rendered selected passages into classical Chinese, was only accessible to educated elites. Subsequently, there appeared prose translations of some passages into vernacular Chinese. Because of the poem's fitful translation history, assessments of Dante's influence in China are best pursued by focusing on responses to the poem by influential writers and intellectuals. And this slide here addresses the next part of my talk. Dante's decision to write his poem in Italian rather than Latin resonated strongly with Lu Xun, dates are 1881 to 1936, one of the fathers of modern Chinese literature, and 𝗓𝗓𝗓, a philosopher, essayist, and diplomat. Both men are associated with the May 4th movement, a student-led nationalist movement which advocated a new culture, one not based on traditional Confucian values. Central to this movement was the promotion of vernacular Chinese, a language that was understood by everyone. Lu Xun turned to Dante in a 1906 essay, and he wrote, "Though Italy was once divided and had collapsed, she could yet remain one, for she had produced a Dante who gave a language to her cause. Hence, Dante became a model for a national language. 𝗓𝗓𝗓, in turn, advocated the creation of a canon of works in vernacular Chinese. Both authors refer to Dante's De Vulgare Eloquentia, a treatise on the Italian vernacular. In their appeals for Lu Xun and 𝗓𝗓𝗓, Dante was a symbol of linguistic and cultural renewal and nationalism. And the slide you're looking at now shows the cover of a recent book with Lu Xun and Dante on the cover. And this shows the extent to which Chinese efforts to promote the vernacular were linked with Dante. Dante also influenced 𝗨𝗪, one of the most important 20th century Chinese authors, who wrote about his admiration for Dante in essays and incorporated Dantesque themes in his work. One poem, the Canto of Demons, describes the experiences of a speaker who wanders around a dream world on a dark winter day, during which he sees many suspicious persons whom he judges, as Dante does in the Inferno. Another work, and this is, you can see the Chinese cover and the English translation, Cat Country, which was published in 1932, recounts the story of a young protagonist who crash lands on Mars. Finding himself the only survivor, he explores a dystopic world inhabited by people with the faces of cats. Elements derived from Dante include the first-person narration and vivid descriptions of forested landscapes. The Martian cat people are guilty of many of the sins condemned in the Inferno: hypocrisy, flattery, thievery, treachery. A dark satiric work, Cat Country, reflects 𝗗𝗏's disillusions with the terror and violence of the early communist era. Ultimately, 𝗗𝗏 found in Dante a model for activism. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, he urged fellow intellectuals to enter the fray, arguing that great works come out of a writer's life experiences. In a 1937 essay, 𝗗𝗏 writes, "Just as we see in Dante's Divine Comedy, regardless of whether it's in heaven or hell, the author's image and character can be seen in the work. Only by entering into the fire of events and by descending into hell can artists and writers perceive the true spirit of the age and succeed in writing works of blood and tears." In such declarations, 𝗗𝗏 calls for literature of great passion, works born of intense sentiments. Dante's bold repudiations and moral vision inspired 𝗗𝗏 to write his own sweeping work, The Yellow Storm, which delineates the inferno existence, or parts of it anyways, the inferno existence of life in Beijing. Living his own hell on earth during the Cultural Revolution proved unbearable. 𝗗𝗏 committed suicide after years of torture and brutalization at the hands of Mao's Red Guards. I'm going to end this consideration of Dante in China with 𝗏 𝗁, a contemporary writer known for her experimental works, many of which have been translated into English. The next slide, please. Among her works, lifelong practice reading the divine, among her works is lifelong practice reading the Divine Comedy. So this slide shows her chapters on Inferno and Purgatory. Like 𝗗𝗏, 𝗏 𝗁's response to Dante is deeply personal. However, this work has not yet been translated. One of my hopes is that maybe somebody in the audience might become curious about Kanchu's work, and it'll be translated, so we'll have more of a sense of Dante's influence in China today. And she kindly answered a couple of questions I sent her. And one was about the passages which most resonate with her. And this is her response. I approach the Divine Comedy as a whole. Every detail is highly compelling. It is an early masterwork in humanity's construction of a new kind of moral character, and not just some critique of society and politics. Every character within it is a layer of the author's soul. Their distinctions are very subtle because it requires the reader's imagination and the complete investment of her mind and body to read it. And as I mentioned earlier, perhaps someone in today's audience will look into this work and translate it, so we'll have a better appreciation of Dante's significance for contemporary Chinese authors. I've chosen a very different example to illustrate Japanese reworkings of the Divine Comedy. Since Dante's poem was more widely diffused in Japan than in China at the beginning of the 20th century, Japanese adaptations are more varied. The Divine Comedy has provided rich fodder for a distinctly Japanese genre, manga, or graphic novels. And two recent ones draw on Dante. This is a very recent one. In 2018, 𝗵𝗎 began a series based on Cesare Borgia, Cesare, il creatore che ha distrutto, and this is an image, this slide shows one of my favorite scenes from book 11 of the 𝗗𝗲𝗃 manga. This chapter focuses on a lecture on Inferno 33 delivered by Cristoforo Landino, an eminent Renaissance Dante commentator. I was really stunned to see this, having written a book on Dante's Renaissance commentators, and to see a manga featuring Landino. So in recent exchanges with Japanese scholar friends, I learned that Soryo collaborates with Motoaki Hara, a Japanese professor, on this series. The 𝗗𝗲𝗃 manga blends high and low culture deftly. The Istituto Italiano di Cultura in Tokyo will host a conversation with Soryo and Hara later this year for the Dante centenary. The mangaka most associated with Dante is Go Nagai. Nagai became interested in Dante after seeing Doré's illustrations in a Japanese edition of the poem. In 1971, he published Mao Dante. Next slide, please. Here's the cover of Mao Dante in Japanese. And this manga is about a young student who is possessed by a demon named Dante, who is the king of the devils. 1 year later, Nagai published Devilman, a story which exploits the conflict between the forces of good and evil. Both these manga adapt Dante loosely. Then Mangai then engaged Dante much more directly in 1994 to 95 in his manga Dante Shinyoku, which translates to Divine Comedy. Now, this is the first of 3 slides that I have from Go Nagai. This one just showing Dante at the beginning of the journey of the Inferno, Beatrice reappearing. And we can see the next slide, please. Here's his depiction based very much on Doré's illustration of the Paolo and Francesca episode. So I'm just going to make a few comments, and then there's only one more slide from Nagai. So Beatrice, as we saw in the earlier slide, is now blonde, and she has the more stylized and plain face of anime women, and she visits Dante directly. Here, Nagai has made Francesca far more buxom. And the next slide, please. All right, this one is Nagai's treatment of the punishment of the avaricious and the avaricious and prodigal in Inferno 7, and it exemplifies the way he intensifies and magnifies the poem for expressive effects. In Inferno 7, these sinners push enormous heavy weights in opposite directions around the perimeter of a circle. Nagai, following Doré, depicts the weights as large bags of money and also amplifies the angry exchanges between the two groups of sinners. Instead of shouting, "Perché tieni, perché burli," why hoard, why squander, as we can see in these the cartoon, the sinners fight violently over the bags of money. Dante's Inferno journey, coupled with Doré's illustration, offer Nagai a motto for strong narrative, bold visual style, and fantastic characters. These are all hallmarks of the manga genre. Notwithstanding Nagai's intensification of his visual and poetic sources, he sticks pretty closely to the basic outline of Dante's journey. I'd like to turn now to artistic depictions which exhibit less obvious relations to Dante's work. Since this is somewhat based in DC, I wanted to pick a couple of examples that are from Washington. In 2015, the Sackler Museum mounted an exhibition, The Divine Comedy, Heaven, Purgatory, and Hell, revisited by contemporary African artists. Guest curated by Simon Mpjami, a Swiss independent scholar and critic, the show featured artworks by more than 40 African artists. The next slide, please. So this slide shows some of the questions that Mpjami posed to the artists. As we can see, Mpjami conceives of hell metaphorically, just looking at the first line. What do your fears look like? Are they located in the dark or in a blinding light? The broadness of his conception, not to mention the unfamiliarity of the artist with Dante's work, may underlie the mixed reviews which the exhibition received. While critics found the works compelling, many noted that they were too far removed from Dante. Don't expect Dante to function as a reference point, wrote the Washington Post reviewer. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's hard to see, or at least it's hard for me to see, maybe you'll see, how Nicholas Lobo's floor sculpture of stitched rubber entitled 𝗙𝗪𝗁, this is a Xhosa term referring to a ball with water or an eye, connects to Dante. And I just wanted to give you one example of a work where one is hard pressed to see the connection. Information provided in the exhibition catalog for two other works include comments by artists on hell. Next slide, please. So about her work, 99 series, Aida Mulune states, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, just a short section of it. Inferno is made of history, not only of a country, but of self, of exile, of bloodshed, of loss, of mourning, of bitterness, of broken hearts and broken wings. The Inferno is not down below, it is here, ever present, next to us, in our memories and in our minds. It is made of delusions, of prostration, of hiding behind masks to validate our existence and our hidden agendas. Next slide, please. It's a mask. This is the work 99's series. It's a mask we wear to fool ourselves and others in an attempt to get ahead, yet we are void in our survival. So the 99 series then consists of a group of photos portraying a young Ethiopian woman whose face and body are painted white and her hands red. Connecting the images with her text is not easy. One might see the white paint as a mask. Most striking is Mulune's assertion that hell is not a place below, but a continuum which we inhabit and which some nations have internalized. To hide this inhabited hell, the oppressed wear masks. Next slide, please. This is the next one I'm going to talk about, and it's entitled The Rope, a series of photos by Muna Carré, a very suggestive work. In her work, her remarks about the rope, she emphasizes the significance of the ominous whiteness, the lost and frightening feeling of a fading rope, which gives only an illusion of stability. The next slide, please. So this is one of the photos, and you can see a better, see it more closely. The photos that, as I'll just repeat the last statement, the artist explains, convey an allegory of disappearance, fragility, memory, and loss. One of my students who wrote a paper on some of the works in the Sackler exhibition suggests that the image of a white rope taut across a forest of bare trees evokes Inferno 1, in which Dante finds himself lost in a dark wood. Carré's photos then offer an evocative rather than direct connection to Dante. What might we conclude about works whose relationship to Dante is is somewhat indeterminate. I saw this exhibition with a Sackler docent and strained to identify connections to Dante's poem. But since then, I've pondered what 𝗵𝗁𝗻 sought to achieve by associating Dante with the works in the exhibition, some of which were created for other shows. 𝗵𝗁𝗻 is a provocateur. He wanted to shock, and he did, by appropriating a Western classic. 𝗵𝗁𝗻 used Dante to elicit responses from the artist and to also provoke strong responses from viewers. The ties of many works in the exhibition are tenuous, but the show stimulated thoughts about what form a contemporary African vision of paradise, purgatory, and hell might take. Adding Dante's name to a project augments interest in the work. The poet's authoritative status imparts importance to other works by association. Dante's renown and name are enough to spark attention. While works with only a tangential connection to Dante are intriguing, I'm more drawn to adaptations which show a deeper engagement with the Divine Comedy. I'd like to turn now to another example from Africa, which does just that. Somali writer Nuruddin Farah's 1978 novel, Links. So you can see the cover and also the quotations from Dante, from Mandelbaum's edition into the first section. There are at least 4 sections, each of which is preceded by quotes from Dante. Frequently hailed as one of the most sophisticated voices in modern fiction and a recipient of the prestigious Neustadt International Prize, Farah currently lives in the US, where he's been a professor of creative writing at various institutions. Links recounts the return of its protagonist, 𝗵𝗱𝗁, to Mogadishu after an absence of 20 years. The novel traces 𝗵𝗱𝗁's travels and conversations as he searches for his mother's grave, reestablishes his friendship with 𝗵𝗁, a childhood friend, and investigates the abduction of 𝗵𝗁's young niece and her friend. The events take place in the aftermath of the Somali Civil War, after the overthrow of dictator Siad Barre, and after the American troops that came in July 93 are gone. One of the most distinctive features of Links are its references to other writers. The intertextual aspect of this work is significant. Among the writers to whom Farah refers are Freud, Voltaire, William Blake, and Oscar Wilde. The most prominent allusions are to Dante. Epigraphs from the Divine Comedy introduce each of the 4 sections of the novel. And so you see now the inscriptions. The first one is from Canto 3, the inscription over the gate of hell. The second one I found really intriguing, and that is Farinata's words to Dante before the 2 speak. And then the third one is from the one of the hypocrites, Catalano, referring to the devil as the father of all lies. So the references structure the first section. In fact, the references structure each section of the novel. Farah portrays Mogadishu as an urban hell sundered by the remnants of 2 clans. In the aftermath of the American intervention in July 93, this is the event about which Black Hawk Down is about. In the aftermath of the American intervention in July 93, Mogadishu has been reduced to a lawless, poverty-ridden shell of a city. Their leaders, Strongman North and Strongman South, along with their respective clans, evoke the divisions between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The quote from Inferno 10, "Who were your ancestors?" highlights the pervasiveness of civic dissension. Just as Farinata wishes to know Dante's political party before speaking to him, so do many of the inhabitants of Mogadishu view others through the lens of clan allegiances. Dante appears in other ways throughout the novel as well. 𝗗𝗲𝗶𝗴 is a professor who studied at the University of Padua. His thesis was a poetic translation of the Divine Comedy into Somali. And 𝗵𝗏 scatters the novel with allusions to Dante. 𝗗𝗲𝗶𝗴's comparison at one point, 𝗗𝗲𝗶𝗴 compares post-war Mogadishu to a ship in a storm without a guiding hand. And this phrase evokes Dante's denunciation of Italy in Purgatory 6 as nave senza nocchiere in gran tempesta, a ship without a helmsman in harsh seas. 𝗗𝗲𝗶𝗴, 𝗵𝗵, and Shamus, another friend who was at the University of Padua with the other two, all also discuss hell during their university days. 𝗵𝗏's novel engages with Dante in a number of striking ways. I began this talk by proclaiming that Dante is everywhere. I hope I've given you a sense of the multiplicity of ways in which other cultures have appropriated the Divine Comedy. I'm going to end with two images. Next slide, please. Okay. So this slide is of a 2006 painting by three Taiwanese artists, 𝗵𝗏 and Zhong Anjun. And it's entitled Discussing the Divine Comedy with Dante. It features 103 famous personages. It'll be hard to pick them up, but you may recognize some of them depending on the size of your computer screen. So among them are Bruce Lee, Charlie Chaplin, Bill Clinton, Picasso, Michelangelo, as well as Chinese politicians, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. And the arrangements are humorously eclectic and whimsical. In the foreground, Shirley Temple leans against a chair next to Tolstoy and Einstein. Next to her are three seated figures, Mike Tyson, Hans Christian Andersen, and Vladimir Putin. To the right, you can see, to the upper right, you can see Dante robed in the traditional red cassock he wears in a lot of early modern paintings. To the right, Dante addresses his celebrity audience, standing behind a wall surrounded by the three painters of the work. Need we look further for evidence of Dante's global status? And I shall end with one final slide. Next slide, please. All right. So I'm going to turn from the global to the local. This last can we go? Yeah. This last image is a statue of Dante in Washington's Malcolm X Meridian Hill Park, a perfect place to read Dante during the centenary. So I hope this brief account has given you some sense of the way in which Dante has been adapted in other cultures. And as you think about, some of you may be wanting to read Dante or pursue aspects of his legacy, then those of you in Washington can go to Malcolm X Park and sit next to the statue of Dante. Thank you, everyone, and thank you all for coming.
Wonderful, and thank you to you too, Deborah, for this incredible presentation. I think, as I expected, that there are several points of intersection, and we have been trying to answer some of the questions already by typing there. So 𝗵𝗍𝗁 𝗁𝗍, my good friend and colleague at Georgetown, and I have the role, I guess, of the respondents. That doesn't mean that we have to answer all questions. Perhaps.
I hope, Francesco, there would be our speakers to answer the question. Because
exactly. Perhaps our role should rather be one of asking.
I'm not sure that I have the answers. So.
No, and when it comes to Dante, you know who can. But Gianni, do you wanna go?
Yes, please. There is a question, and I think this is for Denis. To what extent can Dante's relationship with the church be considered as radical?
Thank you very much for the question. Well, I hope I was pointing in the direction of an answer when I got us up to heaven, to the sphere of the just, and the eagle of the just starts articulating Dante the thinker's problem or problematic position on the idea of justice. I didn't go into detail about that eagle. I mean, the eagle is fascinating because it's skywriting and all those things. The eagle is made up of all these souls. There are in the eye of the eagle, the souls of David and Constantine, also Trajan, another pagan, and most dramatically, 𝗪𝗕his, a fictitious pagan from Virgil's own poem. So Dante, the writer, keeps pushing a kind of radical imaginative response to, in regard to Paradise 19 and 20, the question of what is justice. But, you know, one can look in other places too. So in Hell, in Inferno 7, Dante says among the ecclesiastics, this is a passage that Deborah, one of Deborah's artists, alludes to, 𝗏 perché 𝗏 this is Inferno 7, among the avaricious and prodigal. There are, Dante says, papi in the plural, e cardinali. Among those clerics, there are popes in the plural and cardinals in the plural. And so that's one place in Inferno where you can see, I don't know if that's, he's just telling it like it is or speaking truth to power. If that's radical, we can argue about whether or not that's radical. Is that just being honest? And then among the simoniacs, there is a sin punished in hell, those who take advantage of church office and the dignity of the church to make money. And that, of course, has many, you know, that is very critical of the church. So Dante doesn't hold back from criticizing the church in his own day. And just one final detail regarding Dante's radicalism versus the church. He was so radical in his criticism of the papacy that Protestants in Henry VIII's court, so this is 1530, 40, 50, Protestant intellectuals in Henry VIII's court were given the assignment to go find ammunition in writings that they could use against the papacy so that Henry could justify his divorce. And so the English Protestant movement takes Dante, and you could even say turns him into a kind of Protestant. There are 19th century translations of Dante that are intended to erase the Catholicism and have Dante be a radical Protestant, you know, a protesting voice, an idiosyncratic protesting voice of liberty. And that's one of the reasons why Italian nationalists in the 19th century follow Dante or are proud to have Dante as a leader. I mean, there are lots of other reasons too. And through them, American and English abolitionists grab hold of Dante. I saw in the last image that Deborah put up, this amazing painting, one of the figures sitting at the table with Abe Lincoln and Chairman Mao, I think, is, I believe, Frederick Douglass. And Douglass had in his house outside of DC at Cedar Hill, it's not there now, but he had an image of Dante in his library alongside Abraham Lincoln and John Brown and the Supreme Court Justice Charles Sumner. You know, so Dante became a very radical voice of critique. And part of what he was critiquing often was the church.
Sure, and that is a topic that could go on for a long while, because of course it's central to the whole political and even, you know, theological structure of the comedy. And there's another question addressed to Deborah Parker that comes from Nicolino Applauso, another.
Oh yes, I was about to read that.
Right. Oh, do you want to read it? Be my guest, because it's a very long one, but it's also a very good one, I think.
Johnny. So very thought-provoking talks. Thank you so much to both. I have a question for Dr. Parker about language. I am intrigued by the link between 𝗓𝗪 and Dante pertaining to Dante's comedy, and more specifically to the questione della lingua. 𝗓𝗪 advocated the use of a plainer colloquial Chinese, and this was a significant source of interest for him for his attraction to Dante's work. Are there any other writers, authors, either in China or in neighboring countries within the eastern region of Asia, for example, Japan or Korea, that were drawn to Dante for the same language link? Also, do you think that this link between Dante and language that attracts other authors could also perhaps motivated by internal political issues? It asked, contains the disposition of regulating language from above by political leaders versus Dante's model, a language established from the bottom up by the people, the vernacular language. Thank you in advance for any thought on this.
I'm not aware of other writers, other Chinese writers who sort of appropriated Dante to promulgate a national language. I've read articles on Dante's reception in China, and I spoke to one of my colleagues in East Asian languages, and these are the authors that they mentioned. It was primarily 𝗏shi, Lushun. Ba Jin is another author that I didn't mention, who was also a contemporary of 𝗏ში and Lushun. But the one that I was kind of fascinated by was the most recent one, the experimental writer Canto, who's a woman. And unfortunately, although many of her works have been translated into English, her essay, just a little book on Dante, hasn't. And the only way I was even able to show the slide was my colleague Charles Laughlin in East Asian languages. Not only did he translate the chapter titles, she agreed to answer 2 questions. And he translated them into Chinese, sent them to her, and then she sent back her answers, which he then translated, and then I read out. I'm sorry I don't have more examples.
I see that Denis raised his hand.
Yes, just to add, I mean, this is not exactly what Nicolino Applauso was asking about, and I can talk to him about this off list later, but Ralph Ellison does what these Chinese, is inspired by Dante's language, and Ralph Ellison, the African-American author of Invisible Man, thinks that he's doing something analogous to Dante. To write in English would be, in King James English would be Latin, and to write in the radical vernacular of African-American Harlem culture, street culture that he's a part of, or that he's hearing, would be something different. He does something in between, and he thinks of what he's doing in between as a fusion of, as Latinizing the vernacular, we could say, and he thinks that that's what African-American literary tradition brings to American culture, this fusion, and it's completely inspired by Dante and language.
Sorry, Danny. No, I just want to add a consideration because we have referenced 𝗏𝗏 and I have the Italian translation here of 𝗏𝗏 La Divina Commedia. That's obviously the title that was chosen for the Italian edition. I noticed when I compared it to the English translation, which is available online, that the English bubbles, language in the actual comics, in the English version is lofty and old-fashioned, whereas the Italian is rather colloquial and everyday. It's updated, so to speak. However, I think and I have no idea what it would sound like in the original Japanese, to an extent. But I think I read somewhere that the original Japanese actually makes use of the official Japanese translation or of a translation of Dante's text. So I would be very curious to see what it sounds like in 𝗏𝗏's original Japanese version, to see which of the Italian or English versions stays more faithful to 𝗏𝗏 and why.
There's, I think, 2 English translations of 𝗏𝗏's Dante Shinyoku online, and one of them is the one you mentioned, and they've used some kind of scanning translation app to get the English, and the notes say that they use 𝗵𝗁𝗁, which is a very older 1921-ish translation, and another one by, it's Lawrence, I think. And that, I was very struck by the archaic English as you were. Then I found another one. The problem with trying to find 𝗗𝗏𝗁𝗁's work in English, and I just didn't have time to buy the Italian translation, is that one of them, every time you go into the site, you get all this porn, and I just didn't want to deal with that.
I think, Francesco, we have time for another question or two.
Yes, I think we do. Let's see.
So how does, this is, I think it's for Denis, I'm not sure. This is from John. How does the Commedia transcend the medieval cosmos in which he places it?
I saw that question, and that's too big for me to answer. I mean, it's big. And that's a good question. But here's the answer, or here's the beginning of an answer. Everything that Deborah Parker's presentation points to, these examples of making the classic, let's call Dante a classic on Dantedì, making that canonical text new again, is a way that we get it out of the Middle Ages. You don't have to be a medieval Florentine Catholic, Christian in that time to appreciate Dante. You can be a Protestant in Henry VIII's court, or you can be an African-American abolitionist hanging out with Frederick Douglass, or you can be one of these artists that Deborah is showing us so powerfully. So I think all of those are examples of getting beyond, using transcend and thinking about the word transcend in its etymological sense. They just explode. In the reception of Dante, there is repeated examples of Dante exploding and into modernity, whatever the moment is. And so I think that's a marker of of the poem's extraordinary power, and maybe its canonical value. That's why it's so good.
There were a couple of questions about why Dante called the Divine Comedy the comedy, so the commedia,
right?
Accurate, but I think that Denis already answered during his talk about this point.
Yes, and some answers have also been typed in the box there. And just to recap, it's a crux. It's a problem among scholars, because the answers that both Deborah has typed and Denis has mentioned in his talk, and actually one of my students also contributed to, are explained in the letter to Can Grande. This is one of the most important epistles to explain the meaning of the Divine Comedy and even the title itself. However, unfortunately, it is also the one letter whose authenticity we do not know for sure. It has been debated for a long time, and we are far from reaching a conclusion. So it is not possible to say with certainty whether those definitions of comedy, which refers to both the happy ending story as opposed to the tragedy, which begins in a good position and then ends tragically, and the matter of style being the mixed style, the mixed register, using both high and low registers. It is not possible to say for sure whether those were Dante's own explanations or some counterfeiter who imitated him. Lately, actually, there's even a current, including some important scholars, that question the legitimacy of the title commedia itself. Commedia might, in some people's opinion, only refer to the Inferno. So we'll see. I must say I'm not convinced by that theory, because we know that Pietro di Dante and Jacopo di Dante, the children of the poet himself, comment on the poem. They wrote commentaries and used the title Commedia. They lived with Dante for a while. They must have spoken at lunch about it. And if they used the title Commedia, I would be inclined to thinking that, yes, that is the title that the author meant.
I think, Francesco, we have time just for another question, which is a general question. I think that Deborah can answer that. It's an interesting question. In the Far East, do high school students study La Divina Commedia?
High school, I'm not so sure, but what I did learn, which I thought was fascinating, I learned this maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. There's one Canadian professor who teaches at one of the universities in Beijing named Tom Rendell. Virtually an overwhelming majority of the graduate students, Chinese graduate students in American PhD programs are his students. So he teaches Dante along with other Western classics. And the woman I mentioned earlier, 𝗵𝗁, she also is an Italianist, and she's thoroughly fluent in Italian. She teaches Dante, but I believe at the university level. I asked my Japanese friends as well, and it's not clear to me that it's taught at the high school level.
Yeah, I have a general question because several attendees asked whether these presentations will be available since we are recording that. Do you know that, Francesco? Can you answer that?
I'm sure it will be because all presentations are placed on the website of the Istituto di Cultura. I, however, do not have a link to share with our public, so I encourage them, or maybe Emanuele can provide that, but I encourage the public to go to the website in the next days and search for this.
Yes, thank you so much, Francesco, for pointing that out. Indeed, this program will be available on our website in the next few days, and I really would like to take this opportunity to thank once again both our speakers, Professor Deborah Parker and Professor Denis Looney. Of course, I would like to say grazie mille to our friends at Georgetown University, and in particular Professor Anno De Fina, Professor Francesco Ciabattoni, and Professor 𝗵𝗂 𝗵𝗁. Without your support, and I say this from my heart, this program wouldn't have been possible. I think it was inspiring and educating to spend Dantedì with you, and I hope that with this program we managed to bring even more people closer to Dante. So again, thank you all for connecting with us today. Buon Dantedì a tutti. Happy Dante Day to you all.
Thank you.
Happy Day to everybody.
I would like to take a word of hope for the situation that the whole world was living and conclude with Dante's own quote, "Arriveder le stelle."
Bravo, Francesco.
Buonasera, grazie a tutti.
Arrivederci. Bye bye.
Arrivederci.
Grazie, grazie.